The air's sticky with smoke, the patch of street is a soup of mud and straw, a baker yanks a tray of half-burned rolls through the crowd, and a dog buries its face in a turned-over fish barrel while a monk tries not to gag. That's your opening image. You probably imagine the whole era as nothing but filth, superstition, and people keeling over at 30. But that tidy horror movie caricature misses almost everything useful. In this video, I'm ripping the curtain off 15 medieval myths everyone still repeats like gospel, showing the weird, the gross, and the surprisingly sensible reality underneath. Some beliefs are rooted in truth but exaggerated beyond recognition. Others are later inventions, and a few are just complete misreadings of scraps of evidence. We'll smell the stench, yes, but also meet traveling merchants, stubborn doctors, practical castles, and messy legal systems. Expect to have romantic fantasies gently murdered, and for boring myths to be replaced by stranger, better facts. Come for the debunking, stay for the uncomfortable little truths historians actually get excited about. Number 1, everyone died at 30 except they didn't, and that myth is a math trick. Life expectancy figures tossed around, like average life expectancy was 30, usually mean life expectancy at birth, which is dragged down by horrific infant and child mortality. If you survive to your teens, your odds of living into your 40s, 50s, or beyond improve dramatically. Medieval records, wills, and street scenes show plenty of grandparents, artisans, and cloistered old women who reached their 60s and 70s, especially among property-owning townspeople and the clergy. High-risk childbirth and childhood disease were the great killers, not a universally short lifespan by default. So the brutal reality was uneven. Many died young, but many also grew old. Lifetime varied wildly by class, place, and luck. Tellingly, people who survived epidemics often rebuilt lives, took up trades in middle age, and sometimes became local legends for their stubborn longevity. The died at 30 slogan is dramatic, but it flattens a chaotic human picture into a single wrong number. Number 2, people never bathed, a juicy image, but wrong in scale and context. Bathing habits varied hugely across regions, seasons, and social classes. Urban bathhouses thrived in many medieval towns, pilgrims and nobles bathed in portable tubs, and peasants washed in rivers or at communal washing sites when weather permitted. Clerical sources sometimes complained about public bathhouses as moral hazards, which tells you those places were used a lot, not that everyone avoided water. Of course, hygiene standards were different, and soap formulas, laundering, and water heating were more laborious, so medieval cleanliness didn't match modern expectations, but it wasn't automatic stench and grime for every human every day. Plague-era paranoia and later Victorian prudishness also rewrote the story, turning practical bathing into a supposed universal taboo that mostly never existed. In short, people washed when they could, where they could, and often when they needed to smell decent for market or court. Number 3, the church banned science. That's a tidy villain narrative but historically noisy and complicated. Yes, theological battles and occasional condemnations happened, especially when theology, politics, and heresy collided, but monasteries and cathedral schools were also major centers of learning, preserving ancient texts, translating Arabic scholarship, and training astronomers and physicians. The medieval intellectual world produced universities, surgical manuals, and heavily annotated translations of Aristotle and Galen. Clerics often ran the labs, literally keeping astronomical observatories and herb gardens. The real issue wasn't simple anti-science zeal but tangled jurisdiction. Who taught what, the power of Aristotle's authority, and whether certain ideas threatened doctrine or social order. So rather than a universal ban, think of a negotiation, compromise, and occasional fireworks between religious authorities and curious minds. The Dark Ages versus church story is drama-friendly, but the historical record looks more like a messy alliance with side arguments than a flat banhammer. Number 4, peasants were basically slaves everywhere. That's too blunt and ignores regional legal realities. While unfree labor like serfdom existed in many places, especially Eastern Europe, in much of Western Europe peasants had a spectrum of statuses from free tenants to customary serfs with specific rights and obligations. Many peasants could marry, move with permission, own animals, bring cases to manorial courts, and sometimes buy their way out of obligations. Market towns sucked up rural labor with better pay, creating avenues for mobility. The medieval economic world, with seasonal hiring fairs and manorial contracts, resembles a messy labor market more than a single institution of enslavement. Of course, exploitation happened and lords could be brutal, but the blanket peasant equals slave image erases contractual nuance, local law, and the surprising agency ordinary people exercised. Feudal obligations were real, but they were negotiated, resistant, and varied wildly by place and century. Number 5, knights were always noble heroes. Look, shining armor makes for great fantasy, but medieval knights were complicated humans, not universal paragons. Chivalric literature promoted ideals of honor, courtly love, and restrained violence, and some knights tried to live by those rules. But real battles were chaotic, ugly, and often driven by profit. Many knights were petty landholders who fought to protect or expand holdings, collected ransoms, and switched allegiances when it suited them, blending martial skill with opportunism. Tournaments allowed social theater and status signaling, yet they were also deadly money sinks and sources of violent rivalry. So knights could be generous and brave one day, pillaging and failing at diplomacy the next. The myth of constant nobility comes from idealized literature, not battlefield logistics. Appreciating both the glamour and the grubby reality gives a clearer, less Hollywood picture of medieval warfare and knighthood. Number 6. Castles were comfy palaces. Yes, they had tapestries and thrones sometimes, but think fortress first, boutique hotel never. The thick stone walls kept out arrows and raiders but also trapped damp and cold. Heating was inefficient, sanitation primitive, and living quarters could be cramped, crowded, and littered with refuse unless you were in a select private chamber. Windows were narrow arrow slits or simple glass panes held in lead, letting both light and misery in, and the Great Hall served as a multi-use space for eating, meetings, and sleeping, which meant smells and noise were constant. Castles were designed to withstand siege, not to pamper overnight guests. Comforts were a sign of wealth and status, but that comfort was unevenly distributed and often more symbolic than practical. So when a Hollywood castle glows with warmth and space, remember the real ones traded cozy luxury for defensibility and a well-placed murder hole. Number 7. Medieval medicine was pure nonsense. Some remedies were ridiculous, but the period also had surprisingly practical treatments and careful observation. Practices ranged from herbal poultices, wound dressing techniques, and surgical procedures performed by barber surgeons, to theories like balancing humors that sometimes led to effective symptomatic care. Plague or not, surgeons developed cauterization, ligature techniques, and wound management that could save lives when applied correctly. Herbal pharmacopoeias sometimes contained genuinely antiseptic or analgesic compounds. The problem is not that medieval medicine was uniformly stupid, but that its explanatory theories were mixed with empirical know-how, ritual, and folk practices. Later historians lump the whole system as backwards, ignoring experimental knowledge, hospital care developed by religious orders, and cross-cultural exchanges that transmitted medical texts from the Islamic world into Europe. So yes, expect oddities, but don't throw out the poultice with the superstition. Number 8. No one traveled. The mental image of static medieval villages is wrong. Mobility was a constant hum. Pilgrims crisscrossed Europe to Santiago and Jerusalem, merchants ran long-distance trade networks moving cloth, spices, and coins, and itinerant craftsmen, scholars, and clerics traveled between courts and universities. Seasonal fairs attracted buyers and sellers from distant regions, and roads, rivers, and coastal shipping routes were lifelines for commerce and information. Travel was risky and slow compared to modern standards, but it was routine for many livelihoods and played a huge role in cultural exchange and economic development. Even the poor could become temporarily mobile in search of work or during harvest migrations, undermining the idea of isolated medieval villages. So rather than fixed, static backwaters, medieval societies were interconnected, messy, and mobile in ways that shaped everything from cuisine to legal practices. Number 9. Everyone believed the earth was flat. That's mostly a post-medieval myth. Educated people in the Middle Ages, especially clerics and university scholars, knew the earth was spherical. This idea goes back to ancient Greeks and Romans, and was transmitted through medieval curricula and navigation practices. The flat earth myth gained steam later when Enlightenment-era writers painted earlier centuries as ignorant foils to modern reason, and popular culture amplified the mistake into a universal medieval belief. Sailors, mapmakers, and astronomers relied on spherical concepts for navigation and calendars anyway, which undercuts the flat earth horror story. So while odd folk beliefs existed in pockets, the idea that medieval Europe universally clung to a flat world is an anachronistic smear rather than historical fact. The reality, medieval intellectual life contained more nuance than the caricature suggests. Number 10. Torture devices like the Iron Maiden were common in the Middle Ages theatrical, but mostly later inventions and museum sensationalism. The Iron Maiden as a cage of spikes appears in 18th-19th century displays and was probably inspired by myth and later collectors eager for gruesome spectacle. That doesn't mean medieval interrogations were gentle. Legal systems often used coercion, ordeals, and sometimes physical punishment, But the sensational rack of popular imagination grew with later propaganda and curiosity cabinets. Much medieval torture came from legal forms like judicial duels, ordeals, and confessions wrung out through pressure, not necessarily grotesque mechanical devices that never existed. The difference matters because modern horror shows conflate rare brutalities with routine practice, creating a lurid image that historians can't find in most archives. So the Middle Ages had cruelty, but the medieval torture shop with gleaming iron curiosities is mostly a later fetishized invention. Number 11, Vikings had horned helmets. It's a pop culture accessory, not a historical fact. Few if any archaeological finds support horned helmets as practical Viking gear. Pointed or conical helmets were the norm because horns would snag, break, and be useless in battle. The horned image comes from 19th century Romantic art, opera costumes, and antiquarian imaginations that loved theatrical flair more than archaeological accuracy. Real Viking identity was expressed through intricate jewelry, dyed textiles, and impressive ship technology rather than impractical headwear. Iconography that actually comes from Viking Age art often shows helmets without horns, and surviving finds are functional and plain. So the horned helm is a costume designer's fantasy that stuck in popular imagination, making Vikings look like pumpkin-headed raiders instead of skilled seafarers and traders. Number 12, plague doctors are strictly medieval relics. The iconic beaked mask and full-length cloak belong mostly to later, early modern Europe, not the High Middle Ages. The beaked mask and waxed overcoat arise in 17th century responses to epidemic thinking, and are often retrojected onto medieval imagery by modern media. Medieval responses to plague involved a patchwork of hospital care by religious orders, attempts at quarantine, folk remedies, and sometimes brutal scapegoating. The later theatrical garb added layers of symbolic modernity to earlier practices. That said, doctors and surgeons did exist and tried a range of interventions across centuries, but the dramatic, anonymous beaked doctor is more Renaissance Gothic than medieval everyday life. So when you picture that eerie figure shuffling through Black Death streets, remember you're mostly seeing a post-medieval costume from a culture trying to make sense of catastrophe with dramatic protective gear. Number 13. Witches were burned constantly in the Middle Ages. The peak of witch-hunting violence actually falls in the early modern period, centuries after the medieval era. Medieval Europe certainly had accusations of maleficium, charms, and local superstitions leading to punishment or exile. But systematic pan-European witch trials with widespread executions exploded between the 15th and 17th centuries due to social stress, legal changes, and demonological manuals. Medieval courts often treated alleged witchcraft as part of broader social disputes or heresy issues, and didn't always reach for burning as the automatic response. The later scapegoating frenzy involved new religious anxieties, state-building pressures, and portable demonology texts that transformed accusations into mass panics. So blaming the medieval period for the bulk of witch-burning is historically backward. The flames and mass trials are mostly an early modern catastrophe that draws on medieval ingredients but isn't the same recipe. Number 14, feudalism was a clean, universal system. That's the problem. Historians keep using one label for many very different practices. Feudalism often bundles legal ties, land tenure, military service, and social hierarchy into a neat model. But in reality, local customs, law, and economic conditions produced a patchwork of arrangements across Europe and over centuries. For example, vassalage in France looked different from English manorial obligations or Polish serfdom structures. Some regions had written contracts, others relied on oral custom. Military obligations, rent, labor corvée, and legal immunities could vary wildly even within a single kingdom, making the one-size-feudal label misleading. Modern historians increasingly prefer to talk about specific institutions and practices instead of an overarching feudal template, because the messy truth better explains how medieval politics and economies actually worked. So feudalism exists as a useful shorthand, but it flattens nuance and encourages lazy comparisons. Number 15, medieval wars were constant everywhere. Yes, there were brutal wars, but the medieval world also had long stretches of local peace, economic growth, and negotiation. Warfare was often seasonal, localized, and heavily dependent on noble feuds, dynastic claims, or border tensions, rather than an endless state of continental warfare. Many regions experienced decades of stability that allowed towns to flourish, trade to expand, and cultural life to deepen. Think of booming market towns, cathedral building campaigns, and long-distance diplomacy as evidence of commerce cycles. When wars did break out, they could be devastating, but they were interspersed with treaties, marriages, and negotiated settlements that historians can trace in charters and chronicles. So the sweeping image of constant medieval war is a dramatized trope that ignores peacetime institutions and the rhythms of agricultural life, which governed most people's daily security. War mattered, but it didn't define every century or every village. The Middle Ages was neither a single smell nor a single scream, but a noisy, contradictory era where dirt met learning, cruelty met care, and superstition met surprising practicality. We've just walked through 15 myths that turn an unimaginably messy past into cartoon shorthand. Each myth we busted today hides real behaviors, uneven experiences, and later rewrites that turn complexity into catchy lies. Infant mortality skews averages, bathhouses coexisted with river washes. The church preserved knowledge as it policed ideas, peasants negotiated power, and knights and castles combined honor with economic calculation. The more you look, the more the romantic and the horrific blur into human decisions, local laws, and stubborn resilience. So when someone says medieval as a synonym for stupid or backward, remind them history is better at being weird than being simple. If this ruined your romantic vision in a satisfying way, subscribe for more history that smells like mud and makes more sense than the myths.